Jerusalem Online. Live from Jerusalem, a special presentation with our guest Natan Scharansky and host Daniel Peer.
Shalom and good evening, Chicago. Being only moments away from sunrise here, we are already allowed to say good morning from Jerusalem. We are privileged to share with you our first telecast from the Jewish Satellite Network, the first one in 2,000 years, you might say. With best greetings from all of us here, best greetings indeed from all of us here to all of you, Vice President Bush, and to the 3,000 delegates attending the General Assembly of the Council of the Jewish Federation. We turn now to you in Chicago, and good evening again, Mrs. Cardin.
Good evening to you. I will cut short the introduction because we really want to give as much time to Natan as possible. We thank you for making this available. Tonight we are here to learn about Natan's perspective on recent events. Anything I could say would fall short of his heroic stature. At last year's General Assembly, we who were here heard Avital impassioned plea for his freedom. We believed it would come, but we were not certain it would come so quickly, and we are thrilled today that you are in freedom in Jerusalem where you wish to be.
Thank you and hello. I'm very glad to greet all of you, to say you good evening or good morning. It's difficult because of Rochelle now for me to understand whether it is evening or morning, but of course I'm very happy to have an opportunity to address to Mr. Vice President, with whom I had such nice meetings in the past and who represents for me the administration that made so much for Soviet Jewry, for Ethiopian Jews, and of course for our Israel, to address to the audience where all the leaders of American Jewry gathered. And with my experience of the last days, I only hope that tomorrow in the newspapers I wouldn't read that in the audience to which I was speaking, there happened to be some activists of PLO also. I think that it's very important today when we here, representatives of American Jews, of American administration and Jews of Israel are speaking about the fate of Soviet Jewry, to look realistically at the situation which is today in the Soviet Union with the Soviet Jews. While Mr. Gorbachov is making desperate attempts to represent a new image for the West, while every release of each refusenik is orchestrated so well and is given such a good publicity, the number of Jews who are leaving the Soviet Union is the lowest since during all the 20 years of our Aliyah movement from the Soviet Union. The situation for the Jews in the Soviet Union is worse than ever before. The isolation of prisoners of Zion in the camps from the refuseniks in the cities is bigger. The isolation of the refuseniks from the West is bigger than before. And at the same time, while the number of Jews leaving the Soviet Union is less than ever before, the length of the line is much longer. 400,000 Jews are waiting for their when they will be able to come to Israel. That's why we mustn't be deceived by all those signs of liberalization which we are receiving and which are meant only to mask the real situation. What can we Jews in Israel and of course in America to do? The role of American Jewry during all the period of our Aliyah movement was really great. It's not occasional that in my criminal case more than 300 American Jews are called as my direct criminal accomplices, because it was just you American Jews who kept the world informed about what was happening in the Soviet Union. It was just you who organized that strong public campaign and public and political pressure on the Soviet Union, which made them to open these gates. And now, when these gates are closed again, it's you who can, of course, with the moral leadership of the State of Israel, to open these gates. Now, when the Soviet Union tries to mask the truth about what's happening in the Soviet Union, we must have more contacts with the refuseniks. More and more Jews from America must go there, and not simply for ceremonial meetings, but to go there, to have direct contacts, to gather information, to bring it to the West, to publicize this information. We must make quite a clear message to Gorbachev that all his attempts to reach important agreements with the West cannot be reached without the atmosphere of trust. And this trust can be based only on common values and the values of human rights. That's why without opening the gates for 400,000 Soviet Jews, he cannot be trusted in the West. He cannot reach any serious agreements with the West. As you know, when it was supposed that Gorbachev will come to Washington, there was a plan among Jewish organizations to have a big, massive rally in Washington to demonstrate quite clearly to Gorbachev what American Jews think about the Soviet policy, and that they wouldn't be deceived by their public relations and by their attempts to demonstrate them as liberalized society. And when I was in America in May, many people were enthusiastically greeting the idea of 400,000 American Jews coming to Washington. But then month after month, while I was speaking with the leaders of American Jewish communities, these figures of possible demonstrators were becoming less and less. And finally, I think in the early autumn, when I was speaking with them, they said that the most realistic figure is only 20,000, probably 20,000 American Jews can come to Washington. I said, why so? The solidarity of American Jews with Soviet Jews always seems to be so strong. They said, but you have to understand that it's cold, it's so far, Washington from the other Jewish centers. I said, is it as cold in Washington as it is in punishing cell? They said, oh no, of course not so, but you must understand that to go from Chicago to Washington, it's not so simple, and so on and so on. Well, of course, it's good that finally your administration was very merciful to us and solved our problems by agreeing to have the summit in Reykjavik. But are you sure that next time, let's say, whether it will be in February, March, or whatever, American administration will be also as merciful to us, to Jewish organizations, and will agree to have this in Madagascar or in Borneo, but not in Washington? And if it will be really in Washington, are you really ready to make a clear message to Mr. Gorbachev by coming in hundreds of thousands of people to Washington and to say, let our people go? Only such a massive demonstration can leave no illusions to the Soviet Union, that they have no way to deceive the West without opening the gates for our brothers. I am sure that as it was done in the beginning of the 70s, so now in our hands, in the hands of Jews of the world, in the hands of American people and their leaders, to make the Soviet Union to open the gates for our brothers. When I met with President Mitterrand in France, he said to me that, you know, on this chair many times was sitting your wife, Avital, and though I always tried to help her, but I never believed that she can succeed. And I thought, my God, how naive is this woman if she thinks that she can reach what she wants to reach. But now I see that she was right and I was wrong. So we must be naive, idealistic, and continue struggle, and then I'm sure we'll bring freedom to our brothers. Thank you.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our dialogue with Chicago, we would like to take this opportunity, Natan, to look back in time at some historical moments in your life, moments which none of us will ever forget.
Shcharansky. I'm 28 years old. 3 years ago, I got my first refusal. Almost the same time I got married, and we had a very hard year because I was haunted, I was arrested sometimes. So I want to thank all those our Jewish friends who support us, in my case and the other refuseniks.
Stop.
Most moving pictures indeed. Natan, what do these pictures mean to you now, looking back 9 months later?
It's very exciting moments of my life. I can tell you that while I was crossing bridge, I was thinking mainly how not to lose the trousers which KGB gave to me, but didn't bother to give me the belt. And also I was thinking that a little bit more, some moments more and I'll see Avital. And then when I saw her, everything what was after this was only one song and one dream, and which continues in fact up today. And the fact that now I have baby in my home 9 months after my coming is like the continuation of this dream. But also I think that that moment of my coming there were such big hopes that it's the beginning of new big aliyah, which still didn't become true. And we must do everything that it will become true.
That's what we are doing now. Well, friends, Natan is now open to any questions you at the General Assembly might have. So, Mrs. Carton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The first question we would like to ask is, how has Israel measured up the reality of being there to your expectations and dreams?
Well, Israel is a very democratic society, very open society, and of course the life in democratic open society is much more complicated than the life in punishing cell in Gulag, when the KGB is on one side, you are in the cell on the other side, and you have no other choice but simply to say no to all approaches of KGB. And here, you see, every morning when your wife asks you, would you like to have tea or coffee, you have the problem of choice and your problems begin. But of course, the life, I enjoy every day of living in Israel. I think it's the best country for Jew to live. I think that it's really the country of which I was dreaming during all my long years of struggle for the right to come here.
I'd like now to call on Dan Shamir, who recently returned from a visit to the Soviet Union, to ask the next question.
Tom, many of us have had the privilege of visiting with our refuseniks brothers and sisters in the Soviet Union, and as we've all met here, we commit to one another to heed your call that we should all go visit in the Soviet Union. I would ask you, what should we as American Jews say to the refuseniks? Many of them are depressed and concerned about their fate. How should we encourage them as you were encouraged?
First of all, it's important for them to know what big struggle is held all over the world in their support. It's important for them if you can bring them concrete materials, Hebrew materials on history of Israel, on the history of Zionist movement, if you can take part in their lectures, in their teaching of Hebrew, because it's practical underground, it's believed by authorities to be illegal, and as you probably know, now many prisoners of Zion are in prison only because they were Hebrew teachers and activists of providing Jewish culture. That's all. This is very important. What's also important is to show to them that the spirit of Zionism is increasing all over the world, and to encourage them to go to Israel and to demonstrate deep solidarity of Jews of all the world with their struggle. Of course, it's also very important to gather as much information from them as possible and to assure them that this information will reach the top political figures of the West, and that it will be used on all the negotiations between East and West.
May I ask you another question? Do you see any changes, either subtle or clear, in the way the Soviet leadership is behaving on the Soviet Jewry issues since Mr. Gorbachev has been in power? What ultimately will convince Gorbachev and the Soviet government to let Soviet Jews leave?
As I told before, I think that Gorbachev in some way is more dangerous than his predecessors because he knows how to use democratic institutes of the West for deception of the public opinion of the West much better, and at the same time is much more tough, in fact, in the real situation, in the home situation with human rights and with the Soviet Jewry in particular. On the other hand, Gorbachev knows better than his predecessors how desperately the Soviet Union needs to get access to Western technology, how desperately they need to get access to Western credits, and because they understand better than he is ready to see the truth more than his predecessors about the problems of his own economical situation. And that's what gives the hope. If the Gorbachev will have no illusions that he wouldn't succeed in deceiving the West, then probably if the West will be very firm on these issues, if there will be a real linkage between the human rights problems, like Soviet Jewry problem, and the other aspects of West-East relations, then I think Gorbachev can change the policy of the Soviet Union more sooner than his predecessors.
Could I just ask you, with all of our activity and the activity of our friendly governments, especially the United States government, as you so pointedly indicated, the numbers are pitifully small of Soviet Jews who are being allowed out. Could you tell us what tactics, what actions, what things different should we be doing on this issue?
Well, as I told, I think, first of all, you can encourage people in the Soviet Union, because after all, the most important factor is to what extent Jews in the Soviet Union are ready to struggle. And now, when the pressure is much higher than it was, for example, 10 years ago, there must be really very strong encouragement. And for this, your visits, your letters, all your contacts by telephones and in other ways are very, very important. Second, you must have the campaign of explaining to your political leaders what is the real situation, in order they wouldn't be deceived by the maneuvers of the Soviet government. Third, you must make very clear message to the government of the Soviet Union. What's happening in Geneva? What's happening in Reykjavik? Why there is no progress in the arms races negotiations? Because there is a lack of trust. That's what, in fact, the politicians are explaining. We Jews must clarify this message to the Soviets, that the real nature of this distrust is in the violation of human rights, that while there are prisoners of Zion, while there are thousands of long-term refuseniks, while there are 400,000 Jews who want to go to Israel, while there are millions of Jews who are the victims of forced assimilation, there can be no trust. And this message can be given to the Soviet Union with the help of massive demonstrations, like the one of which I was speaking. If it happens so that Gorbachev will come to the West, it's very important that massive demonstrations will meet him. And of course, what you can do is to try to persuade your governments, your political leaders, to make more strong linkage between all the negotiations with the Soviet Union and the principle of the free immigration, the principle of the right of Jews to repatriate to their motherland.
One last question, because we really don't want to tire your patience. What can we do to help those in the Soviet Union who wish to learn Hebrew, who wish to study more about their Jewish history and background? What is it we can do to assist them in being able to keep in touch with their heritage?
Of course, first of all, concrete help is that you can bring materials. You can, people with knowledge, people, teachers of Hebrew and religious people can come to Soviet Union, can have these meetings. They must have it openly, independently from the fact what their authorities are saying. They mustn't be afraid and discouraged by the attacks on them. And these direct contacts are very important. Also, there must be constant pressure on the Soviet Union to demand to fulfill their obligations. See, I'll give you a very little example that when chief rabbi, from Moscow, when the rabbi of Moscow synagogue was in America in 1984, he was told that they know that there is prisoner of Zion, Shcharansky, who wants to have Bible in the prison, and the authorities don't let him to have it. And American Jews gave him such a Bible and asked him to pass it to me. He promised it. But then, when my mother addressed to him, when I from the camp was writing to all authorities to give me the Bible, the answer of him, of this rabbi, was that the authorities don't let him to do it. At the same time, we just in the last weeks heard a lot of statements of the authorities about the freedom of religion, that nobody in the prisons isn't permitted, isn't prohibited to read whatever religious literature is, while in every zone, in every camp, there are simply printed statements that all religious literature is prohibited. So we must unmask the hypocrisy of Soviet authorities, and we must make them really to fulfill these obligations, pressing on the authorities on one hand and bringing as much literature as possible, supporting seminars, having all contacts with Jewish activists on all levels. On the other, we can encourage Jewish education in the Soviet Union.
There are 400. No, we want to.
Vice President Bush would like to speak to Natan directly, if he may, before he leaves.
Natan, I remember our conversation. Hotel room in Israel. And I remember, I will tell the Chicago audience that one of the things that Mr. Shcharansky told me of, yes, sometimes for quiet negotiation and quiet trying to get people out behind the scenes, but that he hoped that the United States government would not substitute quiet negotiation for continuing to speak out publicly. And what I wanted to tell you is that we will continue to try quietly behind the scenes, bring out cases, this case or that case or whoever else it is, but that always we will continue to speak out publicly against the oppression of Soviet Jews. So have no fear that we are going to resort to solely quiet diplomacy. And I just wanted to reassure you, because of your eloquent plea to everybody you come in contact with, that we will do both. We're not going to change gears, and we will remind the Soviets that they got to do what's right. And it's delightful to see you again.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm also very glad to remember our previous meetings, and I'm glad to hear your clear message that quiet diplomacy can be successful only under the if it is accompanied by the public pressure. And please, pass my best regards and thanks to President Reagan for what he's doing, and I'm sure he'll continue to do for Soviet Jewry. Thank you very much.
We wish you, all of us wish you once again, Mazal Tov, and we will respond in a familiar fashion now to you, the Hitraot Yerushalayim.
Thank you. Shalom, Lichtraot.
Dear friends, this concludes the first telecast of our special service from Jerusalem.
We have a few moments more, but the Vice President does have to leave. I ask you please now to give him the appropriate attention and applause as he leaves the podium.
Shab? Dear friends in Chicago,
Seated, I promise to keep you only a few more seconds. I think this has been an historic evening. For those of you who may not know, it is the first time that the Vice President of the United States has addressed the Council of Jewish Federation. And I think that
Yeah,
is
more interested in that compliment.
It is also the first time, as you heard, 2,000 years that we've had a satellite live dialogue. And I think that's exciting. And I'd like to share with you that the Council of Jewish Federation
I think that's
is
it.
currently studying
גם הוא כנראה.
satellite network.
אני חושב שלא חוזרים אלינו כבר, עכשיו.
All goes well, will be in effect next year. We will not only be able to dialogue across the oceans, but we will be able to meet with each other from community to community, from federation to federation, without leaving our home ground. We have come into the age of technology, and we hope that we can share it well together. Tomorrow morning,
Да.
our business continues at the plenary session.
They're not interested in anymore. In us. They made my message quite clear.
Very clear, very nice. And he was so nice, Bush.